These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. In 722, the true king took the throne. The next 18 years of his reign are the most documented part of Neo-Assyrian history, the most well-understood part of all ancient Mesopotamian history. And yet the man himself, his origins, and his motivations are in many ways deeply obscure. His true motivations, his origins, even his name are totally unknown and subject to over a century's worth of debate ever since his records were first uncovered in the 1800s. But one thing that is beyond question and even more well documented than that is that you can support this show by joining my Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member or by donating directly at oldeststories.net. Your support will help us build an empire unrivaled by the ages. But of course, we're talking today about Sargon, specifically Sargon II of Assyria, and we will probably be in his era for quite some time to come. But the most remarkable thing about him, in many ways, is how little we know about who he is and where he comes from, and what I find perhaps even more interesting is that for someone as well known in historiography, the public perception of Sargon is in many ways at odds with the actual records we have of the man himself. Now, to a degree, it's almost surprising that we would be surprised by any of this. We know so little about basically everyone in ancient history, and our modern recollections of them are always a little bit twisted. Most people whose names are remembered are nothing more than fragments reconstructed, maybe 30 pieces out of a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle set in place just as best we can. With Sargon II, we have something more like 100 pieces of that puzzle, but we're missing pieces that we are quite used to normally having. Where did he come from? Who was his father? How did he take the throne? Speculation on all this is rampant, and many of the more exotic answers have wide-ranging implications. To get a scope of the speculation on offer here, I have seen the following, all proposed quite seriously by well-read scholars of the era. Perhaps Sargon was a mere non-royal nobleman who killed Shalmaneser and took the throne by force. Perhaps he was a prince from a collateral princely line who took advantage of Shalmaneser's natural but perhaps ill-omened death through some non-violent scheming. Perhaps he was born with the name Sargon as a legitimate brother of Shalmaneser, and after his brother's death simply ascended as the next logical person in line. Perhaps he was a religious zealot, inspired by the same general religious trend that was influencing Yahwism and Marduk worship at the same time, and decided to take the kingship to institute universal dominion of the god Assur. Perhaps he was a time traveler, using his knowledge of ancient Mesopotamian history to shift the course of world events. Now, that last one might not be quite so scholarly, but it has just about as much evidence going for it as a lot of the other ideas, which shows more than anything how little we really understand here. Now, for a long time, there was a lot of debate about who his father was. You'll see it stated in quite a lot of places that never once in his vast textual corpus does he state who his father is, leading to all manner of speculation that it wasn't a previous king. Perhaps he wasn't even the grandson or great-grandson of a king. Almost no one seriously thought that he wasn't some sort of nobleman somehow in the wider royal family. To be outside of that bubble would be so very exceptional as to have merited its own comment. Outsiders would likely have applied the son of nobody moniker to him to indicate his low-born status. There are a few later claims that he was a son of Tiglath-Pileser, but you can never be totally sure with that sort of later scribal work. Maybe those guys were just assuming, or maybe it was propaganda. And there is a very late Babylonian literary letter accusing Sargon of having been the son of a slave. But again, that's quite late, and it's very invective in its character. But then, it also turns out that there was a contemporary letter from Babylonian officials to Sargon, which addresses him as the son of Tiglath-Pileser. And then there are also a number of glazed wall plaques, which look like they were only fully translated in 2019, which come from a palace renovation in the city of Assur, which announced that Sargon was the one who oversaw the renovations, and announced that the structure was the Palace of Sargon, great king, strong king, king of the world, son of Tiglath-Pileser, who was also king of Assyria. And so, with that relatively new find, it does seem to have laid to rest 150 years of debate on the matter. There's always some room for speculation, but Sargon, it seems, was a son of Tiglath-Pileser and a brother, or perhaps half-brother, of his predecessor, Shalmaneser. If he didn't mention his father very often, well, the truth is Tiglath-Pileser doesn't mention his own father all that much either, and neither would Sargon's son, Sennacherib. Some kings just seem to have fewer surviving mentions of their filiation, and we always need to remember that we only ever have a fraction of the evidence we'd like to have. Still, it might suggest that Sargon saw himself as a different sort of king than the one who came before, something that will be subtly hinted at throughout his reign, even if I'm not sure that we can ever really pin down what that attitude really is or where it comes from. So if we know that Sargon was a son of Tiglath-Pileser, then we can reliably infer that he had a high government posting, certainly under his father and probably under his brother as well. It would have been from this posting, which people usually assume was some sort of military commander given his later expertise, that he successfully proved himself to the extent that he could later take over. We can't actually find Sargon in the letters of various government officials during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser or Shalmaneser, which isn't super unusual, but a big chunk of this is that there's a lot of debate about what his name even was. We already saw that Shalmaneser was a throne name for a man who carried the birth name of Ululayu, and there is a strong suspicion that Tiglath-Pileser had also taken his name as a throne name, partly because Tukulti-Epil-Ishara, the original form of Tiglath-Pileser, is a fairly pretentious name for someone who wasn't expected to become king, and also because we hear him often called Pul or Pulu, and the usual rendering of the name Sargon, which is Sharru-Ukin in Akkadian, means something like the true king, and it's usually considered to not actually be a real name. It's something that you would make up if you came to the throne with a tremendous agenda. So it's widely assumed that we don't know what name Sargon would have written under in earlier letters, which makes it hard to identify him clearly. However, even this has been thrown into question with more modern work. Sargon, of course, is the Hebraized name from the Bible, and I should actually mention why common scholarship so often Hebraized names. You see, in the early days of archaeology, and even long after Akkadian had started to be well understood, no one had any idea how to pronounce most royal names. The only phonetic spelling of any of these names often came from the Bible in these early times. Akkadian, you see, is a mixed language, quite a lot like modern Japanese in style. They're obviously completely unrelated languages. You have some characters that are phonetic, and you have other characters that are ideograms, whose idea is fixed, but whose pronunciation is not. This is called a logosyllabic writing system by the fancy linguistics people, and it's quite rare nowadays to see a written language in this hybrid form. It's either fully ideographic like Chinese, or it's fully phonetic like basically every alphabet system. The thing about it, though, is that most names are written with ideographic components. If we don't have anyone ever giving us a phonetic spelling of a particular ideogram, then we have no idea how it was pronounced. And such pronunciation likely shifted over the centuries, so we need a phonetic spelling reasonably close to the target period to know for sure what the pronunciation was. Thus, it was actually many years before modern scholarship settled on the idea that Sargon was, in native Akkadian, originally pronounced Sharru-Ukin, based on the early Akkadian name of the ancient king of Akkad. With later refinement, they were able to begin to infer that our Sargon, Sargon II of Assyria, would probably have pronounced his royal name as Sharru-Kenu, because of linguistic drift. And sure enough, we later found exactly one inscription in which his name is written with the ideograph Lugal, meaning king, followed by the phonetic letters Kenu. We are, in general, quite confident that Lugal is pronounced Sharru pretty much through all of Akkadian history, because it's quite a common word. And we have a few writings by Sargon in which he seems to poetically gesture to the idea that his name means true king. True in the sense of just and righteous and things like that. But then we have a few places where we have a radically different phoneticization attached to his name. Lugal is always Sharru, that much is fairly clear, but it turns out that of the dozen or so places where his name has any phonetic spelling at all, Kenu, meaning true or righteous or just, is only used once. And every other time we hear that his name should be pronounced Sharru-Ukin. Now, Ukin is a much more common name element. It means something like established or secured, and we see it in names like Nabu-Ukin Apli, Nabu has secured my heir, or Nabu-Ukin Zeri, Nabu has established my seed or offspring. To hear the name without an object for the Ukin to be acting on is much rarer, but it's not totally unheard of. So, Sharru-Ukin, if that is his name, would mean something like, the king has established, or the king has secured. And the thing about Sharru-Ukin, while it's a rare name in general, it's a name that would be much less unlikely to give to a regular child. That is to say, it may well not have been a throne name, particularly for a boy in the royal household where politics might have played a role in his naming at birth. If he wasn't in some kind of favored branch of the family, he would be signaling loyalty with a name that flatters the current king. To say, oh, here's my baby. Oh, what's his name? The baby's name is the king establishes. And, that makes the people in favor of the current king go, oh yes, our current king is establishing the country and the general order of things. Yes, he's got a good patriotic name there. Very good. So it could have been a smart move politically. Now, which king is being mentioned and why he's being praised for stabilizing anything is harder to say. Some people suggest that Sargon was therefore named in the reign of Tiglath-Pileser, celebrating his end of the increasing disorder that had come before him. But that would make Sargon much younger of a king than most people want to allow. He'd have to be like 22 years old at best. It's not impossible, but most people would peg his birth earlier than that thanks to various context clues like the ages of his descendants and the high degree of competence he had when on the throne. Now, I will say that even those context clues might be misleading. Alexander the Great was, of course, very young when he started his rule, and if anyone was a prodigy, Sargon could well have been. And he could well have had children much younger than these statistical average reconstructions will allow, because he was a king, after all, and he could have been fathering children realistically as young as like age 16 without social disapproval. But my own thought is that we don't necessarily have to find a king who genuinely did establish any sort of security or foundation. All three of the inept sons of Adad-nirari III, and even Adad-nirari himself, were at least trying to stabilize the situation they found themselves in, and a courtier with a vulnerable baby could well have given a name proclaiming that stability had been achieved, whether or not that was actually the case. The debate on this whole thing goes absolutely wild. Some people want to say that he was quite old when he came to the throne, because it had been decades since any king had practically established any sort of foundations or stability. But I mean, again, the king doesn't actually have to be doing good things for the court to tell the king that he's being amazing. And so I think it's all quite plausible, though it's far from certain, that Sharru-Ukin genuinely was Sargon's birth name. In which case, we see an interesting transformation, as he takes the throne, in which he never really takes a new name, but is seen sort of eliding his birth name into something far more grandiose. Nearly every other case that we know of, the king is either just keeps his birth name into his reign, or takes a wholly new throne name. This, as far as I know, is unique. By taking logograms that could be read as Sharru-Ukin, this could have fit in his royal ideology, naming himself as the true king while still retaining his original name to a certain extent. At various points in his reign, such as when he's renovating Ishtar's temple in Uruk, he subtly changes the grammatical determinative before the lugal in his name, no longer pointing the word king to a man, but to a god, usually interpreted here as Assur-Ukin in this context. The god Assur, in his role as king, has established something. The lack of an object in the sentence makes it less clear what his intentions were. It could have been self-aggrandizing. Assur established me. Or it could have been patriotic. Assur established the nation, or something like that. So he gradually got away from whatever predecessor he had been named in honor of, which fits his general attitude of being broadly uninterested in the history of what had come before him. But due to the uncertainty surrounding his native name, not just his birth name, but even the pronunciation of his regnal name, I'm going to be going with Sargon when I talk about him pretty much exclusively. There's a lot more debate and discussion about his name, but that's sort of an overview and where I stand on it. One thing you'll see a lot with Sargon of Assyria is copious references to Sargon of Akkad. After all, everyone knows about mighty Sargon of Akkad today, founder of the world's first empire. And without a doubt, Sargon of Assyria would have known about Sargon of Akkad. But did he actually take the Sharru-Ukin name as a reference to this former Sargon, as if to say that he and he alone would match or surpass this hero from the mists of myth? We have no idea. We really don't know. It depends a lot on how you read his character to say one way or the other. One thing for sure, in all the fragments that we've recovered from his reign, and like I said, he's the most well-documented king in Assyrian history, we never once hear him mention or compare himself to Sargon of Akkad. There are speculations that some of the texts about Sargon of Akkad come from this age of Sargon II, But the truth is that we don't know, and at least part of those datings of those Sargon of Akkad texts are based on the idea that Sargon II took his name from Sargon of Akkad, indicating that those ancient stories must have been popular again in that time. It's a little bit circular if you don't already know that whether or not Sargon took his name from the ancient Sargon. And of course, we call him Sargon II. That's not because he's named after Sargon of Akkad. There was a Sargon I during a very obscure ancient part of Assyrian history, way back when Assur was little more than a tiny city-state with a bit of regional power, and this Sargon I accomplished basically nothing as far as history is concerned. So Sargon II is numbered in reference to that Assyrian Sargon, not in reference to Sargon of Akkad. And that's a lot of hemming and hawing and details and nonsense, but it is important, because that leaves us with a picture of a man named Sharru-Ukin, the scorned younger son of Tiglath-Pileser III. He seems to have had very little attachment to his family. It is a real thing that he seems so disconnected with the ones who came before him that many historians, both ancient and modern, mark him as the start of a new dynasty. And even if it seems increasingly likely that he wasn't really of a new dynasty in the strict lineal sense, this lack of attachment probably stems from him being forced into courtly politics at a very young age, forced to take sides, and maybe not even always being on the winning or dominant side, possibly giving him a very bitter taste in his mouth. But he does take a job in government, possibly as an administrator, possibly as a general, possibly as both, because there was often very little distinction between the two. But he was probably quite high in government, just due to his royal parentage and the accompanying education. And all this positions him to take the throne when his older brother passes away. Now, did Sargon have a role in the death of his brother? And the answer is, we genuinely have no idea. People do just die in the ancient world, and no ancient text recounts that Sargon actually came to power in a violent action. We know that Sargon publicly denounced his brother and tried to erase his name from history with a decent amount of success. And we know that one of Sargon's first actions was to absolutely purge the noble classes of those he considered his political opponents. Over 6,000 rounded up and deported for being the wrong faction, all of which definitely suggests a contested succession, if nothing else. But whether Sargon caused the succession or merely took advantage of it is unknowable. His most recent biographer, the absolutely marvelous Dr. Elahi, suggests that Sargon may have come to the throne completely peacefully, simply being the next brother in line after Shalmaneser's death. I will say this seems a bit counterintuitive to me, but this is a consistent reading of the evidence. For my own part, though, I would bring in one other puzzle piece, that the royal Assyrian presentation of the state religion shifted distinctly under Sargon, and remained changed during all the subsequent Sargonids, the kings who followed Sargon on the throne. Like Jake and Elwood, Sargon appears to have been on a mission from God. He doesn't ever sit down and say it, he does often say that he was selected by Assur to be the god's mortal representative on Earth, but of course, basically every Assyrian king makes a similar claim. It comes with the role of Assyrian kingship, which had arisen way back 1,000 years ago, not even as a king, but in theory as a mere steward, sitting in for the god Assur, who was the true king, and that ethos has never fully gone away, even as the king stood up as a real and proper king over the centuries. But there are many subtle details, and beyond that, a good amount of just general vibes that make it seem like Sargon thinks he's something special. Not just, the king over the largest empire that the world's ever yet seen, not just the appointed representative of God on the earth, but, something really special. And he is, in 722, able to at least convince the army and a faction of nobles and eunuchs that his aura is fierce. He is almost certainly possessed of what the kids call nowadays the Riz. And he has a set of ambitions, a set of ideas that he thinks will fix all the problems of the Assyrian Empire. And as we'll see, he does fix some of the problems, improving on some things that weren't problems, and he makes the Assyrian Empire even stronger and greater than it had been before. He isn't Sargon of Akkad, starting from nothing and exploding onto the world stage, but he is unquestionably competent and terrifying, and he's given command of the world's greatest empire for the next 17 years. When you're given a lot, history judges you to a higher bar. Sargon was given more than a lot and still managed to clear that Olympic-sized bar to secure his place in world history. The first thing that happened, however, was a mass rebellion. Many details are unclear because Sargon didn't really want to talk much about his accession to the throne. In fact, he may have disliked his first year so much that he adjusted his counts of his years later in life just to sort of start counting at year 2 rather than year 1, a fact which causes no end of headaches to those trying to sort out the details of his chronology nowadays. In the last few months of 722 and the whole year of 721, Sargon led no campaigns. This was very bad for a normal king. It's a sign of weakness and divine disfavor, a sign of chaos within the nation, and an inability to mobilize the imperial logistics engine. For Sargon to have made no move in his first year, when we think he had such high expectations of his main character power, was absolutely devastating. Not only would he later try and just not count that first year in his annals, he began to shift the entire empire away from the eponym year name system entirely. No longer would each year be named after the limu official of the year. Instead, it would be counted by palu, how many campaign seasons the king had passed through, essentially changing the calendar system to something more like what we use in the modern world, the whatever year of King so-and-so. In our case, it's currently year 2025 of the reign of King Jesus of Nazareth, and in Sargon's case, they would now write the date as year 2 or 3 or 15 or whatever of King Sargon of Assyria. Many cultures around the world would settle on dating systems quite like this, and in fact, we've seen other parts of Mesopotamia already falling into that. The eponym system of dating years by limu officials is, by this point, quite an archaic remnant of the early Bronze Age. It's a tradition of Assyria, swept aside by a reforming king who thought his every action was blessed by God, and would eventually become successful enough that people around him would start to agree. Now, his first year was ugly. He lost Babylon completely within months. Basically, as soon as they figured out what was going on up north, the throne was taken by Marduk-apla-Idna, a Chaldean remembered biblically as Merodach-Baladan. The king of Hamath led a revolt that swept up much of the Levant, including the beaten but not yet fully conquered Samaria. Whatever political machinations had taken up so much of his time resulted in the purge of over 6,000 enemies, an internal disturbance whose like we've not yet seen equaled anywhere previously in Assyrian history, and a strong indicator that things were deeply, deeply unsettled. Almost certainly he was marching the army around the homeland, bringing death to those who disapproved of him, but by ancient custom he couldn't simply claim that as a military campaign. His job was to march out past the borders of the Mat Ashur, not policing rebellion within it. And so while this is his first victory, it's an ugly one that he can't claim anywhere. Sargon himself claims that there was all manner of perfidy occurring among his enemies, and certainly when talking about Marduk-apla-Idna, the leader of the Babylonian revolt, or Yahubidi, the instigator of the Levantine rebellion, it doesn't look like anything much more significant than subject nations rising up at an opportune moment to secure their own power. But between Sargon and Shalmaneser, and whatever other factions there might have been, both sides were likely accusing each other of being ill-omened and having earned divine wrath. While we do know who wins, and we know that Sargon desperately wants to be the hero of Assur, we have to wonder what directions the omens were actually pointing, especially as his reign would progress. Now, this chaotic rise to power is part of the greater obscurity of Sargon's origins, and it's only when the clock turns to 720 that Sargon finally takes his eponym year, for the limo system will linger even as it becomes less officially relevant, and he sets out to reclaim Babylon from the Chaldean usurper. Recall that it had been basically Tiglath-Pileser's last major act to take the Babylonian throne. The South, with the hubris of an elder brother, will never not resist Assyrian domination. But the regional stranglehold of the Chaldeans and Aramaeans had become so great, and the native power of the Babylonians so diminished, that Assyria started to look better and better in comparison, particularly in light of how benevolent Tiglath-Pileser had been up to that point. And as far as we know, Shalmaneser seems to have enjoyed the same general favor with the native Babylonians. But at the same time, the Chaldeans were scheming, plotting among their various clans to consolidate military strength, and had Shalmaneser not died, he likely would have faced a Chaldean uprising in the next few years in any case. But as it happened, a regime change was always a perfect time to try and establish your independence, partly because a new king might be incompetent, but also because there was a chance that a lot of other people will try and break away at the same time. The downside is that if you're taking Babylon, there's few other places more important in the Assyrian mind than Babylon. And so Sargon announces with the New Year ceremony that his grand inaugural campaign will be down to the south, to retake Babylon from the Chaldeans. Sargon seems to have known Marduk-apla-Idna, at least to the extent that he was willing to unleash an unusual amount of vitriol towards this foe, for more than he would usually record, even for your standard rebel. Sargon calls him the seed of a murderer, prop of a wicked devil, who did not fear the name of Assur, who violated oaths and withheld tribute, and was treacherous. Merodach-Baladan, for his own part, seems uninterested in noting that there was any civilization in Assur at all, noting that he scattered the Subrian barbarians all over the land of Akkad, by which he means the Assyrians. In delightful fashion, he considers that the main thing he did for Babylon was not his military victories or domestic policies, but his ability to correctly undertake the rituals of the Marduk cult, which he implicitly suggests had been being done wrong, probably because the previous native Babylonian kings had been too poor to undertake them quite as lavishly as Merodach-Baladan thinks they should have. My favorite passage about his general attitude is in a text he writes in dedicating some renovations to the Temple of Ishtar. After he finishes reciting the glories of Ishtar and then some of his own achievements and then a bit more on the glories of Marduk, he closes with this: I saw the royal inscription of a king who had preceded me and built this temple. I did not alter his royal inscription, but I placed it with my own royal inscription. Anyone in the future, whether king or son of a king or commissioner or governor or chief administrator or mayor, who, appointed by the great lord, the god Marduk, decides to rebuild the temple Eanna, let him see this royal inscription and let him place it with his own royal inscription for the future. It just seems to me like a wonderfully pro-social exhortation. There's an element of self-interest here, but it's wrapped in an ethic of, I did the right thing, and I hope that future generations will respect the past as well. We don't know a ton about this second Marduk-Apla-Iddina's personality, but I like that little bit of him. I guess we also know that he was a big planner and a big power player. As soon as he grabs the throne of Babylon, he not only has the support of all the Chaldean tribes, at least all the major ones we know about, but he also has a military alliance with the king of the Elamites, Humban-Nakash. The Elamites are in one of their growing phases and are doing quite well for themselves. We haven't heard a lot about them for quite a while, but it says a lot about both the Elamites and the Chaldeans that they show up in 720 as both allies and as sophisticated players on both a military and a political battlefield. Now, Sargon takes the army that he's spent the previous year purging internal enemies, and he directs them down south for the inaugural military victory. He doesn't want to just pick on some minor tribe. He has big plans for his empire and wants to inaugurate his reign on a very high note, fighting against a major opponent and winning. Plus, the significance of the Babylonian revolt will have been weighing on him. We really can't underestimate just how much the Assyrians cared about Babylon. So the Assyrian army swept across the northern border to start the campaign by pummeling some random Aramaean tribes, and these were duly rounded up and punished for joining the Chaldean rather than the Assyrian side, but the army marched on from there. Sargon met the Elamite army near the city of Dur, which served as a sort of gateway to all three kingdoms, though it was traditionally within Babylonian territory. Rather embarrassingly, Marduk-Apla-Iddina did not actually make it to the battle in time, so this is just Assyria versus the Elamites. This is a big deal. This is set up to be like one of the defining battles of Sargon's career, and it becomes that. But the only mention that we get from Mr. Sargon himself is that they did battle at the outskirts of Dur, and Sargon insists that he won. He didn't actually record himself as taking any plunder. He doesn't discuss enemies killed or captured. He doesn't continue the campaign by, taking Dur or moving deeper into Elamite or Babylonian territory. And he doesn't follow up on the battle by attacking Marduk-Apla-Iddina, who was on his way up to Dur at the time. The Babylonian Chronicle is rather less cagey. It records that Humban-Nakash inflicted a major defeat on the Assyrian army and forced them to retreat. And this is exactly what happened. Sargon, who had forced his way into power, was promising great things for the empire and was possibly under accusations of being uniquely ill-omened. Had not only failed to campaign in his first year, he's now lost his inaugural campaign, and a campaign which he didn't even meet his intended adversary, instead falling to the exotic Elamites near the ancient and holy city of Dur. This is bad. This is really, really bad. Sargon has botched the crucial introduction to his kingship, and there must be rumors swirling that the gods absolutely hate him. Now, after his mass political purges, many are probably going to be careful where they express such sentiments. I wouldn't be able to record this podcast in ancient Assyrian times because the king would probably get mad at me for slandering him just now. But if Sargon returns home to Kalhu after this, it's an open question if even his mass purge will be able to save him. The summer of 720 is one of the pivotal moments in world history, where the great Sargon II nearly lost everything. For all that we know, he will pull it out and become one of the few household names of ancient Mesopotamian history. We shouldn't forget that this is a man who has deliberately obscured his origins, scorned his history, and is likely operating under a dark cloud, the sort of cloud that would have been taken as an omen by the Assyrian people, both noble and common. That background will stay with him through his entire arc, and play a key role in some places, and these initial defeats and failures will not be forgotten. But he has a stroke of genius at the last possible second. He turns what could have been a one-year reign into the start of the Assyrian Golden Age. He acts in a way that would only be possible for the Assyrian army, and only under a brilliant logistician with a solid command of how the empire and the army work in concert together. He will, on a dime, abandon the conquest of the south, but what he does next will have to wait for next time. While you're waiting, consider checking out my books, History and Myth from Sumer and Akkad, or History and Myth from Babylon and the Amorites. And if you've been enjoying the show, please consider donating over on Patreon or directly on oldeststories.net. And make sure you're subscribed so that you can join us next time as the Sargonid conquest machine finally kicks into high gear, for some grand strategizing, some tactical brutality, and for the full glory of Assur to finally manifest itself in the actions of King Sargon II. Thank you for listening.
Beneath the fractured sky, certain of his calling, but the throne that he ascended to would come so close to falling. The south fell to a warlord, the west threw off his brand. The year that should have sealed his right poured through his fingers dust and sand. He'll wrench this crooked world in line, bind the rebels, break their will. He'll prove himself to gods and men. Eternity awaits him still. He whipped a weary army south down the old defiant plains. Priests taste iron in the smoke, spearmen curse his luck and name. He comes upon the land of dirt to force the hands of God. His legacy must secure, the king cannot be flawed. He'll wrench this crooked world in line, bind the rebels, break their will. He'll prove himself to gods and men. Eternity awaits him still. fracture snaps the line. If this ruined year defines him, an empire will drown in time.